Well, thank you, Dr. Adesina, for joining us on this
Pleasure.
in this conversation. It's really a pleasure to connect with you, even though these trying times are demanding so much of your time. We know that for the first time in 25 years, African markets are expected to contract. And we know that that's a contraction probably between 2 and 5%, according to the World Bank. And because of that, there's been need for players like the African Development Bank to really step in and buoy growth and try to reverse the terrible consequences of the COVID crisis. You've moved forward on a bold COVID-19 social bond and a $10 billion response facility. Maybe you can give a sense of what those are for our viewers and what it will mean to African governments for a partner like African Development Bank to step in this way.
Well, thanks very much, Audrey. It's great to talk to you. Of course, we all live in very challenging times, and it's a time in which we all we face existential risks in every part of the world. And and any life for me that is lost is one too many, regardless of what part of the world. So we're all in this together. Now, this is a pandemic that has caused economic challenges of unprecedented dimensions. If you take a look at Africa, just the number of deaths is about over 70,000 now. And the number of people that, the number of cases is is over 70,000 and the number of deaths is about 3,000. But having said that, it's an impact on the economy that's actually quite disconcerting, exactly as you said. From the African Development Bank, our own estimates show that in the base scenario, moderate scenario, it should be about a loss of GDP of 1.7%, right? But in a very, very serious scenario, it could go as high as minus 3.4%. But that what means is that the GDP of Africa will decline significantly. It could go anything from about 157 billion dollars for this year to over $212 billion by next year. So these are huge, huge issues. And of course, what is happening also is that African governments do not have the fiscal space to address this. And so obviously they do need to have external support. But we are not simply waiting on that. At African Development Bank, we have launched a very bold facility of $10 billion to support African countries to address this coronavirus problem. That includes, by the way, $1.4 billion to support the private sector, because we must not forget the private sector. The small and medium-sized enterprises are very, very critical to keeping jobs going, and they form the largest part of the economy in Africa. Now, we also, as you rightly said, launched a really unprecedented social impact, social bond on the global market for $3 billion. We were able to do it for a coupon rate of 0.75%. And you look at it, it is also the largest social impact, social bond that is US dollar denominated in world history ever. And so we've been doing a lot of things to be very proactive in supporting African governments in doing this. And so, but I do believe that the amount of money still needed is quite a lot. African countries will need to have, roughly about $150 billion to allow them to effectively deal with the fiscal gap that they have this year. So yes, lots been done, but a lot still needs to be done.
I'm glad you brought up the question of fiscal space, because I'm sitting in Washington and we're debating today another stimulus package of $3 trillion, and African governments don't have those options when it comes to massive stimulus and direct payments to citizens. Progress is being made on the debt relief effort. There are moratoriums from the G20 on debt payments. And I know negotiations are going on bilaterally, but also with the private creditors. So what do you think are the next steps in ensuring that African governments do have additional fiscal space?
Well, first and foremost is that we during this particular period, we all agree we have to do what the doctors tell us. We have to do social distancing, and everybody's doing social distancing. That's fine. Put our mask on, and we are doing that. But what's not acceptable, though, is fiscal distancing. And we must realize that what this pandemic has actually shown us is that huge amount of inequalities globally, right? Lots of vulnerability, especially in parts of the world where incomes are low and a lot of poor people are there, and they do not have the social protection to being able to do that. And Africa falls into that particular category. You were just talking about the issue of fiscal space. Now, take, for example, this year. we estimate that the fiscal deficit of African countries will go anything from go up by 3.4% to about 4.9%. So that means that they will need at least, anything between $110 billion to $154 billion to be able to close that particular gap. It's happening at a time where they cannot, like the United States and Europe, launch fiscal stimulus packages. The degree of freedom they have on the macro space is very, very limited. The amount they also have in terms of fiscal space is very, very tight. It's like you got a bucket and it's literally dry. And at the same time, you have to water your plants or whatever. So that's essentially the challenge that Africa faces. Now, as the rest of the world obviously deals with it through fiscal stimulus and what have you, the issue of debt has also come up. Okay, if you take a look at what has happened to Africa right now, right, because of the economic shocks from this pandemic, the currencies in many of the countries have been devaluated. So with that devaluation, obviously comes the fact that the cost of their servicing debt will actually continue to rise, right? So access to liquidity is becoming a problem. And that's why, we started a conversation. I'm really delighted the G20 started that conversation about what can be done to actually address the debt issue for Africa. Because the reality is, Audrey, that debt is going to rise from $1.8 trillion last year, which is about 60% of the GDP, to $2.1 trillion at the end of this year, which will be about 65% of the GDP. That's total government debt. And so there are three buckets that one needs to look at. There is the bucket of the private creditors, there is the bucket of the bilateral financiers, and of course, there's debt that is owed to the multilateral development banks.
And
so
it seems to me the most progress is being made on the multilateral fronts, and that there are some very innovative things going on, given that China, for the first time as a bilateral lender, has agreed to join the G20 and the multilaterals in some form of moratorium on payments. The question, I think, comes in that first bucket that you outlined, which is the private creditors, because so many African governments over the last couple of years have been raising money on the Eurobond market.
Yeah, absolutely right. And that's why in trying to deal with that, one has to make sure that you deal with it in terms of debt standstill at the same time. In other words, the bilaterals do it at the same time as the private creditors do it at the same time. But in trying to get the private creditors to do that, you got to worry about the ratings, what that really means for the ratings of those that have actually gone to the Eurobond market. And so I believe that the rating agencies have to be part of that conversation, being sure exactly what it is. My own personal view is that these situations are arising not because the fundamental macroeconomic things changed or because there was problems in terms of fiscal management of the countries, but simply because we have a global externality, which is a global pandemic, which has affected everybody. So ex post, right, the countries are getting downgraded for what they are not really responsible for doing. So in a way, it's not fair to really do that. So I do think that there ought to be a consideration of how that debt reprofiling can be done for the private commercial creditors, but also for the bilateral creditors. Now, in case of the multilateral development bank, it's very, very important for us. We're in the long haul to protect our preferred creditor status and make sure that we can continue to access the international capital markets and borrow money, which are AAA, at a cheaper rate that we can lend to countries. Because look, after all this is done, this is just like, you're going on a highway and you get a detour out of it, a very difficult detour because of pandemic. We're going to have to come back again to that same highway and continue the long journey of development. And so the countries will still need to have access to significant amount of money at cheaper rates, which is what the MDB systems are actually set up to do. So I think it's a balancing act, making sure that we can support African countries, but making sure we also reinforce and do not undermine the business model of the multilateral development banks.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Mr. President, about the role the African Development Bank does play, leveraging its great credit rating in order to borrow money on behalf of African governments, and then manage the risks internally because you're on the ground, you understand the risks, you have risk mitigation abilities. You mentioned earlier about the inequalities that exist in this world, and those inequalities are obviously not only in the economic sphere, but also the health sphere. And we're seeing that play out. How do you think African governments and the African citizens' experience is different than, say, countries in Europe or Asia or Latin America even? You know, one of the things I continually look at are the informal economies. We know that African countries are highly informal in their economic activity. Some say up to 70% informal activity in terms of GDP, and certainly in terms of job creation. Over the last 10 years, 90% of jobs in Kenya have been created by the Juakali sector, that are those who have to get out and work every day. So, how do you see African economies structurally different than so many of the other emerging market peers?
Well, I think it's the structure of the economies right now that have actually shown up also its vulnerability in the face of the crisis. Roughly 75 to 80% of Africa's private sector is actually informal sector. And that informal sector is largely small and medium-sized enterprises. And as a result of that, they're not really set up, to be as resilient as businesses in Europe or United States or others when they are hit by a shock. Now, for many of them, right, a day without work is a day they have to go hungry. It's just that simple, right? And so the issue is, as the rest of the world was able to deploy fiscal stimulus packages and to do wage payments for people, unemployment benefits that have been paid, well, it doesn't exist in Africa. Everybody goes without having those things. So in a situation where you have high level of poverty, you have high level of vulnerability, and without the needed social protection, it's been very, very difficult, and that's why it's been very difficult for people to maintain the lockdown, because, I mean, it's like you may make it through COVID-19, but you're going to probably die from hunger anyway. So that is very, very important. Many of the countries, quite a number of the countries, too, I must say, have tried to respond to that. A number of them have COVID-19 support facilities, not many of them, just some of them, where they are able to pay some of the SMEs, defer some of their payments, provide a little bit of tax breaks for them here and there. But at the end of the day, lack of social protection actually shows the vulnerability of Africa's large population. So, we have a saying in my language, Yoruba in Nigeria, that says that the eye that cries must also see at the same time, right? And one of the things that I am seeing is the need for us to make sure that first, we turn a lot more of our informal into formal sector. Second, that there be actually clear programs to ensure we have a lot of social protection for everybody. Everybody must have social protection, have insurance, health insurance. This is very, very important. And finally, is that you will notice that, you mentioned Juakali, for Kenya and all of that. You will notice that even in slum areas, when they try to distribute food, like in the case of Kenya, there was just a stampede of people in Kibera, for example. Well, because people just need food. And that's one thing we must not also forget in this discussion. Almost 60%, 55 to 60% of Africa's population are right now in the rural areas, right? They depend on agriculture. So we're talking quite a lot about the health pandemic. But if we do not support majority of the people that are smallholder farmers and majority of those who are in the rural areas whose livelihoods actually depend on agriculture, we may face a food crisis at the end of it. And that's why I said, you look at Kenya, for example, they're going to right now a humongous problem with the case of the locust, the desert locust, which is I call locust 19. So you go from COVID-19 to locust 19. I mean, this locust cover about 150 million per kilometer square, and they can eat the food that can be enough to feed 35,000 people in one day. And so we need to make sure that we are not just looking at the issue of COVID-19. We are paying attention to vulnerability. We are paying attention to social protection, and that we are paying attention, in particular, to food security.
Yeah, the health crisis becomes a food security crisis, and then there's the challenge of economic recovery. But I'm glad you mentioned some areas of innovation, because I've even seen in your home country in Nigeria groups of entrepreneurs getting together to crowdsource a stimulus plan, right? So they actually raised money and as a group began to give it to individual Nigerians that were applying. So we are seeing some innovation in this space. And for the last 20 years, the mantra has been African solutions for African problems. But now it's very real on the ground. For the first time, elite across the continent and are not flying to Europe for healthcare because they cannot. They have to be in their local hospitals. That there's reality where the startup community, instead of hiring a software producer in Germany, you're going to be able to find a Nigerian software producer to solve your tracking and tracing problems. So you really do have an impetus to source solutions locally while global travel is at a standstill. So I really want to say in my last question, what are you seeing in the area of innovation and what is giving you hope during this crisis, Mr. President?
Well, always in any crisis, it always throws up opportunities, right? And so as in Africa, we've seen that in this crisis. For example, take the whole issue of testing, right? Because the level of testing, although still very, very low in Africa, right? The testing kits are very expensive. They're $60 to $100 per kit. In a continent where income levels are so low, it's very difficult to be able to do that. Well, however, you take a look at Senegal, right? There's an institute of Pasteur there that's been able to develop a kit for mass testing, which costs about $1 to be able to do that. And they are working with a good company in the UK to do that. That's great innovation. You look at South Africa, for example, it has begun to turn its manufacturing capacity to produce ventilators. They didn't have to do that before. Everybody was always importing from outside of Africa. You look at Kenya, where you mentioned, and many other countries, they are producing the masks themselves, the medical masks, by themselves. And so you've seen a lot of these innovations that are happening. And take another one, for example. During the lockdown, it's very difficult to monitor how many policemen can you put on the road, how many soldiers can you put on the road. But some countries have actually innovated in terms of the use of drones. You take Rwanda, for example, use drones to be able to carry samples from one part to other parts of the country for testing. You look at Ghana, that was able to use drones to actually monitor compliance with lockdown in different places. And I think these are fantastic innovations that are coming up in Africa that you see. And I'm very delighted with that. But I will say this, before I answer your last point of your question, is that what the future looks like for us in Africa in terms of the health sector. I really think that it's time for us to build what I call an Africa quality health infrastructure defense system for Africa. Africa went through Ebola, Africa went through H5N1, Africa went through the HIV, and Africa is going through, like everybody else, with this coronavirus pandemic. But Africa does not have a real, in fact, it has a very, very weak, very poor health care infrastructure. So at the African Development Bank, we have started our conversation to help Africa to develop what I call this quality healthcare defense system, infrastructure healthcare defense system that it needs to have at the primary healthcare level, secondary and tertiary. The second part of that is pharmaceuticals. Take it, for example, take pharmaceuticals. Africa has only 375 pharmaceutical companies for 1.3 billion people. China has 7,000 for 1.4 billion people. India has 11,000 pharmaceutical companies for 1.4 billion people. So Africa needs to build a first-rate pharmaceutical companies to being able to address many of these. So what gives me hope in the midst of this? First, what gives me hope is that, well, in the case of Africa, that fortunately so far, the numbers have been quite low. As sad as it is, the numbers have been quite low and the number of deaths have been quite low. I'm also very encouraged by the opportunities that I see that Africans are taking in terms of stimulating new regional value chains, supply chains to essentially relocalize a lot of things that are being imported to being able to be manufactured on the continent. And that's a good thing. And what I'm also seeing is that I'm delighted that we are reinforcing, we all collectively, we are reinforcing the importance of regional institutions, to be able to address African problems there. I'm also encouraged that African leaders themselves, have been quite cohesive throughout this whole process. I mean, the President of South Africa President Ramaphosa, who is the chair of the Africa Union, has led the work, I mean, a lot of the conversations with many of us on how to do this. And at the end of the day, this is a very resilient continent. You know, we've gone through Ebola, we've gone through H5N1, we came out of it resilient. We're going to go through this with all the work and support of everybody else. And we are going to get back to the business of growing this continent and accelerating its development as we should. So all of that gives me hope, even in the midst of very difficult circumstances. I think Africa is resilient, and I think we'll continue to do so.
And absolutely, and it seems that you're not letting a good crisis go to waste in terms of that innovation. And things like digitizing customs, digitizing government operations, all of those things that will be kind of fast forwarded by COVID will really undergird a future and more robust growth for the region once this phase is over. So thank you so much, Dr. Adesina, for joining today from Abidjan. And we wish you safety and to ensure that you can continue on this good fight to support African governments during this time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. I appreciate it. And you stay well, stay safe, and stay healthy.
Thank you.
All right. Take care. Bye.